Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
A man dives into the pool of a motel in St. Augustine, Florida, on June 18, 1964, trying to expel a group of white and African American integrationists who refused to leave in protest against racial discrimination. The group had entered the pool to challenge the establishment's segregation policies, and the motel manager, in a desperate attempt to remove them, jumped into the water to force them out. Shortly after, frustrated by his inability to remove the protesters, the manager, James Brock, returned to the pool with an even more drastic attitude. He poured acid into the water, shouting, "I'm cleaning the pool," in an attempt to intimidate the group. Although no one was seriously injured, the act shocked the country when images were published by the media. This incident increased public outrage and helped pressure the government to prohibit discrimination in public places. Members of the American Nazi Party surround people participating in a peaceful sit-in at the counter of a lunch counter in a drugstore in Arlington, Virginia, in 1960. What was most shocking was that at the time, the presence of a young black person in a lunch counter caused more outrage than the fact that members of a Nazi party were there, openly supporting white supremacy and segregation. Emmett Till, just 14 years old, was brutally murdered in Mississippi after being accused of whistling at a white woman. The crime was committed by the woman's husband and his half-brother. The trial of the two men took place in September 1955, where an all-white jury acquitted them, despite all the evidence and testimony. A military policeman on a motorcycle is parked in front of the entrance designated for colored police officers. Police stations also maintained racial divisions, designating specific areas for African Americans within their own forces. Even black police officers who were tasked with maintaining order had to enter through separate doors and use different facilities from white officers, reinforcing the existing racial division at all levels of society. Two women turned to the side, avoiding looking at two people of color. On one side, whites enjoyed all the rights, while blacks and Native Americans were systematically oppressed and excluded. The regime of segregation separated people not only in public spaces, but also in social interactions, creating a division that influenced even the most subtle actions, such as avoiding eye contact. Civil rights protesters run from the water as they are attacked by a group on the beach in St. Augustine. The scene, captured amid the tension, shows when about 50 people began assaulting the activists with punches. This happened when the protesters attempted, for the second time, to use a segregated beach, normally frequented only by whites, to challenge the discrimination laws. Protesters marched through the streets of Harlem, holding photos of New York City Police Lieutenant Thomas Gilligan after the death of James Powell, a 15-year-old African American, on July 15, 1964. The protest, which began in response to the fatal shooting, quickly turned into 6 days of chaos, with the community demanding justice and facing police brutality. The incident intensified racial tensions, resulting in 1 death, 118 injuries, and more than 450 arrests. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and charged with vagrancy in Montgomery on September 3, 1958, while attempting to attend the trial of a man accused of assaulting Ralph Abernathy, a Baptist minister and civil rights leader. This arrest was part of a pattern of intimidation and repression against the main leaders of the civil rights movement. Events like this highlighted the fierce resistance faced by those seeking to dismantle segregation. In this 1965 photo, we see Mildred Loving and her husband, Richard P. Loving. The couple challenged Virginia's laws that prohibited interracial marriages, resulting in the famous case Loving v. Virginia. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case culminated in the 1967 decision that declared all laws restricting interracial marriages unconstitutional. This decision was a major advance in civil rights, ending anti-miscegenation laws and guaranteeing the right to equal marriage nationwide. Black customers were forced to climb several stairs to enter theaters, where they had to sit in separate areas, usually in the balcony. Besides the physical effort, these areas offered an inferior experience in terms of comfort and visibility. The entrance to these spaces was often through side or secondary doors. Even so, theaters charged the same price for tickets, despite the unequal conditions offered. The spring of 1963 brought a wave of protests against police brutality and discrimination in Birmingham, Alabama. Police Chief Bull Connor, known for his ruthless stance against civil rights, responded with extreme violence. He ordered fire hoses to be used against protesters and released dogs to intimidate and injure demonstrators. Additionally, police used physical force to beat unarmed people, including women and children. A visibly apprehensive little girl sits in the front row of the classroom, the only black student in her newly integrated class. In 1957, Tennessee began to desegregate schools, but the process was slow and faced much resistance. Being the only black child in a room full of white students brought enormous pressure, causing her to face suspicious looks, isolation, and even hostility. A classroom is nearly empty after white students refused to attend their newly desegregated school in New York in 1964. Although New York was outside the South, school segregation was common, sustained by geographic division, where predominantly white and black neighborhoods had separate schools. When desegregation began, many white parents resisted, pulling their children from the schools. In the photo, we see the wreckage left after the Rosewood Massacre, which occurred on January 9, 1923. Rosewood, a small, predominantly black town in Florida, was set on fire by an enraged white mob after a false accusation by a white woman against a black man. For 7 days, the town was attacked, with houses burned and several residents killed. The survivors fled to save their lives, leaving the town in ruins. Young black prisoners, shackled, work in the fields under surveillance in 1903. Even after the abolition of slavery, the conditions of exploitation and control over African Americans persisted. Historians call Jim Crow laws slavery by another name, as they maintained the subjugation of blacks in America. This system exploited black prisoners' labor under oppressive conditions, disguising the continuation of slavery practices under legality. David Isom, 19, broke the color line by entering one of Florida's segregated public pools on June 8, 1958. His simple act of protest, by disobeying the rules that separated whites and blacks, led to the immediate closure of the pool. This closure reflected the frequent response of the authorities at the time, who, instead of allowing integration, preferred to close establishments, showing the fierce resistance to desegregation. Here, we see an African American man using a drinking fountain designated for colored people, next to a fountain for whites. The quality of the drinking fountains for African Americans was visibly inferior. They were smaller, poorly maintained, and often located in less accessible or poorly lit areas. In contrast, the fountains for whites were larger, of better quality, and more hygienically maintained. This difference reinforced the idea of racial inferiority in American society at the time. Black citizens are seated at the back of a bus following South Carolina's laws in April 1956. If the bus was full, they were required to give up their seats to white passengers. For many African Americans, the bus was one of the few transportation options available, as many could not afford a car. Additionally, train and taxi services often discriminated against blacks or did not serve areas where the population was predominantly black. Outside Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, a white student strikes an effigy of a black student while a crowd of students watches. The incident occurred amid strong resistance to racial integration in schools following the Supreme Court's decision to end segregation. The effigy symbolized the hatred directed at the Little Rock Nine, the first black students to integrate the school in 1957. Two members of the National States Rights Party hang an effigy of Martin Luther King Jr. outside the party's headquarters in Birmingham, Alabama, on May 6, 1963. This grotesque act occurred while King was leading peaceful protests against segregation in the city, known as the Birmingham Campaigns. The use of an effigy was an extreme form of intimidation and threat against leaders of the movement, especially King, who had become a prominent figure in the fight for civil rights. Police examined the wreckage of Hattie Cotton High School in Nashville, Tennessee, on September 10, 1957, shortly after the school was bombed. The entire east wall and 4 classrooms were destroyed in the attack. Despite the severity of the bombing, fortunately there were no deaths or injuries. The violence was triggered by the simple fact that a single 6-year-old black child had been admitted to the school for the first grade following desegregation. Elizabeth Eckford, 15, courageously walks toward Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, followed by a hostile crowd on her first day of school in 1957. This moment occurred after the Supreme Court decision that declared school segregation unconstitutional. As part of the Little Rock Nine, Elizabeth was one of the first African American students to attempt to integrate the school, facing an enraged white crowd that opposed her presence. Public restrooms around 1960 with 3 separate doors labeled ladies, men, and colored. This separation was a common practice in many states where Jim Crow laws established separate facilities for whites and blacks. Although all were public spaces and claimed to be separate but equal, these facilities rarely offered the same standards of comfort and cleanliness. A police dog attacks a young man during the Birmingham Youth Mass demonstration in May 1963. The photograph, captured during one of the most violent scenes of the civil rights movement, shows how police used extreme force to suppress peaceful protesters. Images like this, widely broadcast by the media, generated public outrage and helped increase support for the civil rights movement, pressuring the federal government to act.
A strong military presence dominates the campus of the University of Mississippi in September 1962 to protect James Meredith, the first black student at the institution. President Kennedy ordered the mobilization of troops in response to violent resistance to racial integration. Thousands of white protesters attempted to block Meredith's entry, resulting in violent clashes and riots that left 2 people dead and hundreds injured.
An African-American protester shields himself from blows by a white man in front of a segregated restaurant in Nashville on May 1, 1964. On that day, violent clashes occurred between civil rights protesters and white men and youths, resulting in 4 African Americans being injured. These peaceful protests, often met with violence, were part of a broader campaign to end segregation in public spaces like restaurants and lunch counters. National Guard troops with bayonets raised surround kneeling integrationist protesters in Cambridge, Maryland, on May 13, 1964. About 100 peaceful protesters were attempting to challenge a no-demonstration decree issued by the military commander. These protesters faced a military presence ready to suppress any disobedience in one of the most tense moments of the civil rights struggle in the city. A police officer carries a young woman while 3 protesters lie on the ground beside the police station in Tulsa, Oklahoma. These protesters were part of a group of 54 people who were arrested at a city restaurant for peacefully protesting against segregation. The group used the tactic of nonviolent resistance, going limp when arrested, refusing to cooperate, and forcing the police to carry them to the station. Fire hoses spray water with force over the porch of a house in Rochester, New York, on July 27, 1964, as an African-American woman stands firm, resisting the water pressure, while her companions hide behind the porch wall. Police used the hoses as a way to disperse protesters who were demonstrating against police brutality, racial inequality, and poor social conditions in the city. On June 11, 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace tried to block African-American students Vivian Malone and James Hood from entering the University of Alabama in an event known as the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door. Wallace, a segregationist, challenged the federal government's decision to end segregation in schools. After intervention by President John F. Kennedy and the National Guard, he was forced to back down, allowing the students to enter. Protesters gather in front of the Arkansas Capitol in Little Rock, carrying signs with the message "Race mixing is communism" in a protest against racial integration on August 20, 1959. Amid the tensions of the time, opposition to integration used this rhetoric to associate the civil rights struggle with the fear of communism, exploiting the climate of paranoia that dominated America during the Cold War. A driver sleeps under his truck at a service station in 1940 because there was no place for blacks at the location. At that time, African Americans were often prevented from using service stations, dormitories, and hotels. This forced black travelers to improvise, sleeping in their vehicles or outdoors, as they did not have access to basic accommodations. The entrance to the parish prison in New Orleans displays separate visiting hours for whites and blacks. Institutional racism affected even the prison system, where the rights and dignity of prisoners and their families depended on their skin color. In addition to keeping whites and blacks separated inside the prison, this division caused logistical and emotional difficulties for African American families who had to adjust to restricted visiting hours. White children play in a lake under a sign that reads, "For European Children Only," in 1956, during apartheid in South Africa. This system of racial segregation separated the European population from the native blacks, imposing rigid divisions in almost every aspect of life. The policy mirrored Jim Crow laws in the United States, aiming to maintain control over non-white populations and denying them equal access to services and resources. In 1942, in Detroit, white residents protested against the relocation of black families to the Sojourner Truth Housing Project. Although legally African Americans could live in white neighborhoods, in practice, they faced strong social resistance and violence. The project was created to house African American workers moving to Detroit to work in factories during World War II, but the idea of integrating these communities sparked great opposition. Kenyan student David Mbiti encounters segregation for the first time at a bus terminal in Georgia in 1960. Coming from a country where racial segregation did not exist, Mbiti was shocked to see separate areas for whites and blacks at the terminal. Signs indicated where each group could sit, eat, and wait for the bus, and the experience of racial exclusion was a brutal revelation of reality in the United States. A sign at the entrance of the Memphis Zoo informs that today no white person is allowed at the zoo. This photo is from a Thursday, the only day of the week when African Americans could visit the zoo, while the other days were reserved exclusively for whites. Known as Negro Thursday, this practice was common in several cities. Although this opportunity was limited, the zoo was still one of the few leisure places accessible to black families. In 1942, in Detroit, Michigan, white tenants erected this sign to protest the arrival of black families at Sojourner Truth Homes, a federal housing project. At the time, racial tensions were high, especially in areas where public housing sought to integrate different communities. The Sojourner Truth Homes were created to provide affordable housing, but many white residents resisted the idea of African Americans moving into their neighborhoods. At Santa Fe Station in Oklahoma City, Charles N. Atkins, his wife, and children look at a sign that reads, "Waiting Room for Colored." It was 1955, and racial segregation was still present in public spaces in the southern United States, keeping whites and blacks separated. Just 1 month after this photo, the Montgomery bus boycott would ignite a more intense fight for civil rights. Rosa Parks is fingerprinted by a police officer in Montgomery, Alabama on February 22, 1956, 2 months after her act of resistance. Rosa was sitting in the mixed section of a bus. When the front section, reserved for whites, became full, the driver ordered Parks and other black passengers to give up their seats. While the others obeyed, Rosa refused to stand up. Her courage led to the famous Montgomery bus boycott, led by Martin Luther King Jr. At the Tennessee Capitol in Nashville in 1956, both U.S. and Confederate flags fly on a parked car, which displays the phrase, "Save our children from the Black Plague." This message reflects the deep racism of those who saw desegregation as a moral threat to white youth. Segregationists used expressions like this to spread the idea that integration would endanger the purity and values of whites, using children as symbols of a larger cause. Women and teenagers protest in front of William Franz Elementary School, shouting at police officers while 3 young black children attend classes for the second day in 1960. Among the protesters' signs, one that stands out reads, "All I want for Christmas is a white clean school." This type of racist message was common among those who opposed integration, who viewed desegregation as a threat to the purity of their schools and communities. Rosa Parks, Center, rides a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, after the historic Supreme Court decision that ended the 381-day bus boycott. The boycott demonstrated the power of peaceful resistance and the strength of the African American community in the fight for civil rights. Often called the mother of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks became an icon of this struggle, inspiring other civil disobedience movements across the country. An African-American high school girl in Little Rock watches a class on television in 1958. During the lost year, the city's public schools were closed by Governor Orville Faubus to prevent racial integration. While white students from wealthy families could choose private schools, distance education programs broadcasted on television became one of the few options for black students to continue their studies. Whites-only taxis parked on a street in Georgia in 1962. This practice of separation limited access to transportation for African Americans and created difficulties in their daily lives. Even in emergencies, it was common for whites-only taxis to refuse rides to African Americans. Taxis for blacks were rare and often operated under poor conditions. As a result, many African Americans relied on rides from the community or taxis driven by black drivers. A teacher instructs a segregated class of black students in a simple classroom at an underfunded school in rural Georgia in 1941. At that time, schools for African American children received far fewer resources than white schools, resulting in poor teaching conditions. The classrooms were overcrowded, with few books and teaching materials, often used and damaged. The black shanties were low-cost housing where many African Americans lived in the southern United States. These homes were small, poorly built, and had inadequate infrastructure, reflecting the lack of economic opportunities and housing segregation of the time. Many African American families were forced to live in these marginalized areas without access to basic services such as running water or electricity. A man prays over the grave of a loved one in a cemetery on All Saints' Day in Louisiana, 1938. At that time, black communities often had to create their own cemeteries. Without adequate funding, these sites were built on poor land and poorly maintained, often in potter's fields. The graves were simple, with minimal infrastructure, and the markers were made with improvised wooden tools instead of formal tombstones. A white woman and an African American woman sit side by side on stools at a lunch counter as a form of protest in Nashville, Tennessee, 1960. This peaceful act, known as a sit-in, was a common strategy of the civil rights movement, where protesters occupied seats in segregated places to challenge racial discrimination laws. By sitting together, these women demonstrated unity and determination to end segregation in public spaces. In the photo from January 18, 1964, United States President Lyndon B. Johnson, Wright, meets in his White House office with leaders of the civil rights movement, including Martin Luther King Jr. and Roy Wilkins, who was executive director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This meeting took place a few months before the Civil Rights Act was passed. In Cairo, Illinois, a public swimming pool was converted into a private pool to prevent African Americans from entering as a way to avoid integration. This tactic was common during the desegregation period, where local authorities or owners would transform public spaces into private ones to circumvent federal laws. By declaring the pool a private property, they could continue excluding African Americans and maintain racial division. African American children look through a fence at a playground they cannot play in Alabama, 1956. Jim Crow laws separated whites and blacks in almost every aspect of public life, including parks and recreational areas. These children, who just wanted to play and participate in normal childhood activities, faced the harsh reality of being excluded simply because of the color of their skin. Here we see a waiting room designated for African Americans at a bus station in Durham, North Carolina in 1940. These spaces not only physically separated people, but also often offered inferior conditions, with fewer seats, inadequate cleaning, and poor maintenance compared to white areas. While African Americans could buy their tickets at the same counter as whites, they had to enter and exit through different doors. African Americans carry a coffin through the street under a banner that reads, "Here lies Jim Crow." This symbolic march represented the fight against the racial segregation laws known as Jim Crow, which separated whites and blacks in nearly every aspect of social life. The coffin symbolized the desire to bury, once and for all, the discriminatory practices that affected the African American population. African American students attempt to be served at a lunch counter reserved for white customers in Portsmouth, Virginia, on February 16, 1960. The sit-in was a common tactic used by civil rights activists to challenge segregation laws. By sitting peacefully in spaces designated only for whites, these students faced hostility and were denied service, but their actions were essential in drawing national attention to the injustice of segregation. A storefront in South Dakota displays the notice, "No beer sold to Indians," in September 1939, highlighting the prohibitions faced by Native peoples. Just as Jim Crow laws affected African Americans, Native Americans also lived under rules that limited their rights, such as the prohibition of buying alcohol, owning land outside reservations, and voting in some areas. Although not the same, the exclusion and marginalization of Native Americans created effects similar to racial segregation. An African American family buys ice cream on the colored side of a store in Alabama in 1956. At that time, in many southern cities, ice cream shops and other dining establishments would even use different utensils out of fear that whites and blacks would share the same cups or cutlery, reinforcing the absurd belief in racial purity. A class of law graduates poses at Howard University in Washington around 1900. Institutions like Howard University and Fisk University were created to offer higher education to African Americans when almost no other colleges accepted black students. These universities played a crucial role in training professionals and leaders in the African American community, providing opportunities that would normally be denied. Here we see the African American Seabees of the 17th Special gathered during the Battle of Palayu in World War II. While whites fought on the front lines, African Americans were often assigned to support roles. The 17th Special defied these expectations, showing their value in combat. Their contributions helped pave the way for the desegregation of the armed forces, which only occurred in 1948 with President Truman's executive order. The Clark Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee displays a sign that says, "The best service only for colored," in October 1939. Due to the restrictions of the time, black travelers often faced long journeys without access to adequate accommodations or essential services. To meet this need, establishments like the Clark Hotel emerged, offering a safe alternative for African Americans amid segregation. You could easily find the Clark Hotel in the Green Book, a travel guide for African Americans that recommended accommodations and safe places. First published in 1936, the Green Book became an essential tool for those who needed to travel safely, offering a list of hotels, restaurants, and gas stations that welcomed African Americans. The guide helped families avoid areas where they might face discrimination or danger. A passenger points to one of the segregation signs that would be removed from all buses of the Dallas Transit Company, following the United States Supreme Court decision on April 25, 1956, which prohibited segregation in all public transportation. This decision was a major victory for the civil rights movement, marking the end of the practice that separated whites and blacks on buses, trains, and other means of transport. In 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a historic march from Selma to Montgomery, protesting against the disenfranchisement of African Americans. This march was one of the most significant in the civil rights struggle, highlighting peaceful resistance and the determination to end the barriers to voting, which were systematically imposed on the black community in the South. Along the walk, about 25,000 civil rights activists joined the march from Selma to Montgomery. They faced fierce resistance, including police violence and threats, but the perseverance of the protesters drew the world's attention. The 54-mile journey culminated in a historic victory when the pressure from the movement resulted in the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here we see 200,000 African Americans gathered in Washington along the reflecting pool at the end of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, held on August 28, 1963. This historic march ended with Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech, delivered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. The event brought together people of all races and backgrounds, united in demanding racial equality, better job opportunities, and an end to racial segregation. President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act in the East Room of the White House on July 2, 1964. This was a significant victory in the civil rights struggle, as the law prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It eliminated the unequal application of voter registration requirements and ended racial segregation in schools, workplaces, and public spaces.
A sign in a Johannesburg park restricts the use of the lawn to European mothers with babies in arms. Areas that were meant for common use, like parks, were strictly controlled to ensure that black people were kept away from whites, even during family leisure moments. While apartheid was still in force in South Africa in the 1970s, the United States had already made progress in the civil rights struggle and the abolition of segregation laws.
Native Africans burned their pass cards in protest against past laws, which controlled their movements since the British and Dutch slave era. In 1952, these laws became stricter, requiring Africans to carry a reference book with their personal information under penalty of arrest, detention, and torture. Burning the cards was an attempt to challenge the apartheid regime and reject the restrictions imposed on their freedom of movement. A young black man boards a whites-only bus in an act of nonviolent resistance against apartheid in 1986. This challenge to segregation laws was risky, as the South African government continued to repress non-whites. However, as more groups joined the protest, the anti-apartheid movement gained momentum. Acts of non-violent resistance like this were inspired by the methods of the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King.
Dorothy Counts was the first black student to be admitted to an all-white school in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1957. This photo was taken on her first day at Harry Harding High School. 15-year-old Dorothy faced taunts, hostile looks, and intimidation from other students and people present. Her admission marked yet another important step in the civil rights movement in the United States. In 1957, Dorothy faced intimidation on her first day at Harry Harding High School, and the boy behind her is Woody Cooper, one of the young people who participated in these taunts. Decades later, in 2006, Woody decided to apologize to Dorothy. He sent an email confessing his participation and expressing his regret. In an act of generosity, Dorothy forgave him, ending a cycle of pain that had lasted 50 years.